Okay, just to start off, this is like the second part of our first presentation. So in the oral history one-on-one, we kind of wanted to show overall what oral history is, like how to, when you have never done oral histories before, just how to basically, the first steps to take when you're thinking about starting your oral history collection. Leslie, and if you could go to the second slide. Thank you. Dan, are you back with us? Okay, you have to turn your microphone on. So this is the table of contents for our presentation. So hopefully Dan will be fully back with us. This is kind of what we prepared for today. What is the oral histories place in the museum collection? Like how can we use oral histories in the activities that museum has? Planning your community-based research if you want to work on any specific oral history collection. A case study of the collection that we started working on. We're going to talk a little bit about designing your questions. What are the ethics of oral history process, then processing oral history. So what to do after you have all the recordings. And we prepared some of our book recommendations that I think are really valuable if you want to see what you can do with oral histories afterwards. How can you use the content to create different publications? And then we have a Q&A section in the end for your questions. Dan, I think you're back.
I am.
Okay, great. Yeah. So let's continue because the next slide is yours. So.
Okay, so so obviously, I think a oral history has a multitude of places in a museum's collection. I'm going to go through some examples and just kind of highlight some key functions that a museum can have with oral histories. So obviously preservation, I mean, there's a staff that is focused on the preservation of physical materials, paper and other artifacts. So museums kind of primed for the preservation of physical objects. So with a lot of interviews done before I'd say even 2009, they have physical components that go with them. That could be the storage medium that they're put on, whether it be CD, cassette, VHS, what have you, which are worth keeping along with the interview itself. And then a lot of the time, the physical paper transcript that goes with it. Also, museums have public availability for research. Those artifacts will be available to interested members of the community and to researchers the entire time the museum exists. But probably, I mean, the most prominent way that oral histories are shown throughout the museum is through its exhibitions and other displays. So I'm going to go through 3 examples of exhibits that we've used oral histories in and how they kind of compare and contrast with each other. So firstly, Leslie, if you could change slides, please. Thank you. So this was Leaving Vietnam in 2017. This was an oral history about the Vietnam War and its impact in Central Florida to coincide with the Ken Burns documentary that came out in 2017. So in this exhibit, we used oral history quotes mostly to serve as a background for information about the times, whether it was about military service in the Vietnam War, both from the South Vietnamese side and from the United States, or whether it was the refugee journey to the United States, or then refugees building a new life in Orlando. So for the next slide and the next exhibit is Another Year Passes, Pulse in 2018. These oral histories were mostly coupled with an artifact that was donated to us. So as you can see in this top left-hand panel, that is a quilt on the right-hand side of the picture. And then in the center of that photo is a painting done of a woman who was doing an oral history with us about why she decided to do that quilt. The quilt had 49 photos of the 49 people that were killed during the Pulse massacre, and then describes why she donated it and why it was important to her. The bottom right-hand picture is of photographs taken by a local photographer at UCF. And at the bottom, companies why she decided to do this. So the artifacts are really expounded upon by the oral history information that was collected by us. So, and then in the final example that I'm going to talk about, 100 Years of Caring. So this was Orlando Health. You have the oral history quotes are combined with donations, but also talk about the oral histories are used to kind of humanize this large institution that's 100 years old, that has had, thousands of employees and has had a tremendous impact in the area locally. So the oral histories are used to not only expand upon, the times that people are living in and humanize them, but are also tied with the artifacts. So in the middle photo, the right-hand side was donation from an African-American nurse from her daughters. And to the left of it, it describes segregated hospitals and life under segregation. Above it, in the far right hand, you can see kind of a pink jacket. And underneath that is a quote that she has about service. She worked in the auxiliary as a volunteer for, I believe, 40 years for Orange County, for Orlando Health and its predecessor organizations. And then at the bottom, in the top, it's very difficult to read because of how big the pictures are, but it's a quote from an oral history about hospitalization at the time. Obviously, that was from a doctor years before. So those are kind of the ways that oral histories can be used to really expand upon and personalize some of the other functions that a museum does. And that's just the beginning. So in the next slide, there are other ways it can be displayed. It can be displayed as raw audio or video presentations. One of the problems with that is the high cost of quality recording equipment. I mean, that for that, I think that it would be useful to get a videographer and people who are really focused on the art of making a beautiful video presentation. So those are some ways that other museums have used them, and they're wonderful key parts of exhibits that have been done at other places. Okay, so.
Yeah, so the next part is about planning your community-based research. So how do you start working on a specific oral history collection? As a few words of introduction to this slide, I just wanted to say that I understand that, especially if you work for the museum environment, it doesn't necessarily, oral history collection is not the same as working on a research. Like, it doesn't have to conclude with an article or any type of, content-based materials right away. So it's not really research per se. However, we want to make oral history collection available for researcher, and we want the collection to have research value. That's why I think that when you start working on oral history collection, you should think a little bit as if you were a researcher at that time, to kind of add this extra research value to it. So when it comes to any social research, you have to answer a few questions before you start planning it. The first one is conceptualization of your research problems. So it's, what do I want to research? In many cases, you already have some guidelines or policies that your institution has to follow. For example, for us, we collect history of Orange County and 6 neighboring counties. So just by our policy and guidelines, we are limited to what do we want to research, because we cannot just go around the entire US and collect all interesting stories that we find, amazing. That would be great, but this is not what our institution does. So this is like the first step that already, answers the question. However, if you would like to start a very specific oral history collection dedicated to one neighborhood, let's say, or some significant community in your collecting area, you should probably think of how much time and resources you have to spend on that. So you have to answer yourself if you want to limit limit yourself to certain gender or generation, or if you want to interview anybody who has lived in the community for any amount of time, or maybe only those who have lived there for more than 20 years, you know, just to kind of keep it like organized and not just go on and interview whoever you think, you know, whoever wants to be interviewed. Or it's always good to have like some limits to your project. The other question is, how will I research it? So it's called operationalization of your research questions. So we already have most of the answer. We use oral history as a method, so a biographical interview. However, it's always good to use what's called triangularization. So a lot of different research methods combined. So you may also think about doing an extensive data research before. So just reading about the community, trying to find publications, any data that you can find. Also participant observations. So you would like to attend events, go to festivals, you know, just to be part of the community for a while to learn more about it. And those are basically things that, you know, kind of accompany your oral history project. Another thing, searching for possible community partners is always very good and very helpful when conducting any research. And importance of the informants. So informants, when it comes to field research, informants are people who are part of the community that you research, but are kind of like a bridge between the community and your institution. So it's good if those people have a little bit more cultural sensitivity about the problems that you're researching, who understand how your institution works and what oral history is. So you can share more information with the informant about the process of your research. So the informant can give you more insight into the community, while also kind of like recruit people that are good for, you know, that are suitable for your oral history project. Also for the language purposes, especially if you're interviewing people whose first language is not English, it's really good to have somebody who can cooperate with you with the right language skills, and not only language, but also this cultural sensitivity to be really helpful with your research. And time flexibility, very important to remember. Even though you may work 8 to 5, when you start working on a specific project, you have to be ready to go on events on the weekends. You have to be ready to do interviews at night, you know, after 5 p.m. So just something to be aware of, that when you start working on collecting specific content, you can't really expect it to be closed within your regular office hours. So now we can move on to our case study. We started working on this project last year. Like, we really started planning this project last year, but we started interviewing people around February, and it was really not long before the pandemic started. So it kind of like, you know, slowed down everything. So I can't really tell how much, you know, how much we will be able to finish this year. But this is a good example of how you can think about starting a project. So it's the name of the project is Preserving Haitian American Experience in Central Florida. We started with finding a community partner. I mean, we really found the partner first, and then we came up with the project. And the partner is local library, Orange County Library System. We wanted to do something with oral history. We got together and we decided that the Haitian community in Central Florida, we don't really have too much about this community in our collection, and we really wanted to collect more. And we thought that this is going to be very interesting and very valuable project. It happened that the library system already has some connections with the community through some of their employees, and they kind of became our informants. So we could, they could share some cultural information with us. They also speak Haitian Creole, so that was very helpful. So this is how we basically spend, like, I would say 4 or 5 months on just collecting and gathering information. So like we found out, for example, that there are larger number of people here that are in the United States with the temporary protected status granted after 2010 earthquake. So this information told us that there may possibly be some additional things that we'll have to consider when it comes to protecting personal information, because there's like this big thing about the protective status being ended, and then it got prolonged finally, but we don't really know how much time we have to actually talk to the people with this status and how willingly they will share their personal information with us. So this, brought us to a path of exploring our policies and our ability to still talk to them, but also be able to protect their personal information. Dan, did you want to add something about the project?
Not necessarily about the case study, but in general, I was thinking, because you mentioned, like age demographics. If you were thinking about trying to do a certain age group, your time flexibility is really going to be an important thing to keep in mind if you wanted to do a certain age cohort, because I would say easily the most time flexible people are normally retirees, because they're able to meet with you during like a 9-to-5 schedule. But if you have like certain age groups or things like that you would like to interview that don't necessarily fit in that time frame, you're probably going to end up doing a lot of interviewing after 5 and on the weekends, because I think working people or people with children, it's a real struggle during the work day or during the work week even to kind of find time to meet up to do interviewing. Just a thing to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we can continue.
Okay. So I know we talked about designing questions for the other part of the webinar, but I just wanted to expand upon it. Keeping in mind some things we talked about last time as well, make sure that your questions are open-ended. An easy way to kind of make sure that they are is try and stick to how and why questions. And another thing that I would suggest is attempt to do a pre-interview, just questions with the person. Could be, just a very basic phone call. The goal is always to have the first time that you speak shouldn't be the time that they show up for an interview. Another thing, just broadly, is don't assume that because a person has lived through a historical event or a historical era, they have a personalized story with it. There's the example they say there, living through the civil rights movement. Doesn't mean that a person has a personal connection. Just for Aleksandra and I, Aleksandra was an infant during the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. That doesn't mean that she has a personal story about, marching in solidarity marches, or, I don't remember watching the Berlin Wall fall because I was 2. Because I lived in the United States during Occupy Wall Street, I don't have any story with it. So just ask very broad-based questions about people's lives and try and hammer that stuff out in a pre-interview question of like just the basic kind of broad things that you'll be discussing. Probably that'll all be figured out by the virtue of what your project will be and finding informants and things like that. But just broad-based, that's what I'd like to say. So next slide. These are some more specific things. So like we said before, it's not, I think it's a good idea to write out questions before an interview, but that's not necessarily everybody's way to approach interviewing. But either way, you're still going to have questions that you're going to come up with during the interview process. It's just how it goes. For example, I did an interview a few weeks ago with a local African-American woman. And during the time that I was talking to her, she mentioned going to a bunch of segregated beaches and the experience of attending segregated beaches. And it was not something that I had prepared to discuss with her, but just because of that topic, then you have to kind of delve in and ask questions about it, because that's a thing in local segregation stories that, at least from what I've seen, there's not a ton of information about. So, the people who attended them and what they did at them and things like that, there's some photos, but it was nice to collect somebody talking about it. So these are some things to keep in mind when you're asking these like follow-up questions and things like that afterward. So for re-traumatization, the idea is that to avoid it, you should ask broad-based questions and allow the person to discuss it as they feel comfortable with. And then fill in the gaps with follow-up questions, who and why questions, just to get some more logistical information, but not to try and push a respondent any further than they have or are comfortable with saying anything. Also, it's okay for people to get emotional. You should let them process it, get through it. If there's been more than a couple minutes of them crying and it's hard for them to talk, then maybe it's a good time for a break. You can pause the recording. You can give them a couple minutes to just kind of collect themselves, or maybe it's a good time to stop for the day. Sometimes that's a good place to just pause, take a step back, and restart questioning either in a little bit or maybe after a few days. But either way, just let them run through emotions as they see fit. Aleksandra, is there anything you want to add?
No.
Questioning like emotional topics, anything like that?
No, I think just from my experience, at least, everybody reacts differently, but it's also okay just to stay quiet for a while. Just not to overwhelm the person with your support, if I will put it that way.
I agree.
Yeah, people get very emotional, but they don't really expect from us, they just want a little bit of time for themselves. So usually, at least what I do, and I think it usually works, is just stay quiet for a while, and that's usually the best strategy. Or just take a pause and just sit with the person and wait until it's a good moment to.
And I think too that's an area where cultural attitudes can kind of show. I think that it's easy to kind of give off the implication of like you can stop crying now, of like you should stop being emotional, and instead like you just want them to run through it, and it's okay to just be perfectly quiet. And if we were in person, normally I would carry a box of Kleenexes with me, and then if they start crying, I just kind of quietly slide it across the desk. And then if that continues for a couple more minutes, I'm like, why don't we take a break? I got to go to the bathroom or something. And then, you can just kind of proceed after that and see how they're doing afterwards. But again, absolutely not. Great, also great advice. Just kind of quietly sit there and just let it go over it. Okay, is there anything else you want to add?
No, that's fine.
Okay. And then lastly, one thing that I like to keep in mind kind of as like a general thought when I'm writing my questions or just kind of thinking about them generally is if someone was to ask me about the worst thing that ever happened to me, how would I want them to phrase it? So try and keep that same like empathetic belief throughout the time that you're writing these questions. The general idea should always be this is a collaborative effort, and I should try and be as empathetic as I can to the person that is sharing their story with me. So next slide. Okay, and then lastly, keep your questions neutral and allow the narrator to lead the way with their story. So this also kind of builds off re-traumatization, with the idea with that being allow them to share their story as best they can. And then if you need logistical information or who and when this occurred and things like that, fill that up with follow-up questions, but avoid judgments in your questions. So when you're asking somebody, like for example, if you were talking to a veteran, and you were talking to them about, the end of their military service. Personally, I wouldn't phrase the question, how great did it feel when your term ended in Iraq? I think a better question would be, how did you feel at the end of your first trip to Iraq? How did it feel when you got home? How do you think about it looking back at it now? You know, you don't want to telegraph what you want them to say, because if you ask how good did it feel, well, maybe it wasn't good, or maybe it was neutral, or maybe it was very bad. I mean, we don't know. That's why I ask the questions. So try and avoid value judgments. Could be negative, could be positive, and just ask them how they feel about things. Is, I think, generally just a good thing to keep in mind. Aleksandra, any last thing on questions?
Nope.
Okay. Next slide, please. All right. So talk about questions. We talk about it really throughout the entire thing. This is a collaborative endeavor. So like we talked about displays as well, it's important to be clear with the person who's sharing their oral history with you what the purpose of the research will be. So if your idea is that we're going to use this in an exhibit, it's great to clearly explain this is the exhibit that we're planning on using this oral history for. If you have an idea of how it could be displayed during the exhibit, that's a great idea too, because, you know, if the interview is going to be displayed on a 12-foot wide projection wall, and it's about you know, you want to let that person know, like, am I okay with a giant projected version of my face repeating this story of mine? And that's just with them to kind of share whatever they feel comfortable with. And then another one with sometimes before the interview starts, or just if you've known the person, you might know that they have a story, you know, that they might share off the recording. And if you are interested in recording that story, I think the best thing to do is ask them before the recording started, hey, before this started, you mentioned story about X. I just wanted to make sure that it's okay with you once I turn the recording on. I'm going to ask you to repeat it. Instead of just turning the recording on and then asking them about it, because they might have shared this with you off the tape for a reason, and they're not, you know, sometimes people just want to talk about their lives during these interviews and they don't want to do it on recorded material, and that's just how it is. So always allow the narrator to share what they feel comfortable with only. Anything else about ethics, you think, Aleksandra?
No.
Okay. And also, oral history ethics is, I mean, whole books about it, whole reams of books about it. So, next slide, please.
So we're moving on to processing oral history. So again, that itself is probably a material for another another presentation. I just wanted to say that it's very good to have a plan of how do you want to process your oral histories before you start doing your project. So, you know, very often people get very enthusiastic about recording other people's stories because it is very exciting and it's a great job. It's very interesting. But there is also the other side of it, which is processing those interviews. And this is much more time consuming and not as exciting as doing actual interviews. So it's good that you will have a plan what to do. Otherwise, what also often happens is that people collect a lot of interviews and then they just sit either in the shoebox in a pantry somewhere or on live, you know, they live digitally, but nobody really knows what those interviews are. So it's really good to have a plan already. So there are really two ways to process oral histories. The probably most desirable one would be to transcribe the interviews word by word, but it very rarely really happens because it's extremely time consuming and very expensive. It also requires people with certain language skills because you're transferring spoken word into a written word, and you cannot really cut anything out of the, you know, out of the narrative. So you have to write everything down, but you have to write it in a way that it's easy to read. So it requires a lot of language skills. So it's not that anybody who can write can do it. It's not that easy. And it's, as I said, very time consuming. So what museums and other institutions that collect oral histories usually do, they create audio logs and field notes, which or documents that are somehow mirroring those documents that we are using as well. And I'm going to talk about it in a second, but just as an overall introduction, other things that you should remember about when creating oral history archive: adjusting your cataloging process to available technology. So you can re-examine, rethink what kind of software or program is my institution using right now? Like, how do I see oral histories in my collection? Am I going to treat them as an object, an artifact? Am I going to create a completely separate catalog, separate way of processing oral histories just for oral histories? Do I have money to do that? Do I have money to open a new website just for oral histories? Those are all questions that are, difficult to answer, but they're very important when it comes to processing oral histories, because oral histories are a little bit different from all the other objects that museums usually have to deal with, have to, work with. So just look into your available data, your available technology, and see where do you see oral histories as part of your overall collection. Understandable language, you wanted to make available for the public. So just keep it simple and straightforward. You don't have to use super sophisticated language. Just try to be straightforward and understandable for more or less, general public. And what is very important is consistency. Of course, if you find out that you've been making some terrible mistake, change it. But other than this, just try to be consistent and just do everything the way you decided to do. It's always good to create some processing procedure document for many reasons, but the main reasons are that anybody who starts working with you can get acquainted with the way you work on oral histories by reading the document. And also, if you ever stop working for your institution, whoever comes after you can read the document and know how you are doing certain things and understand the process and continue doing the process the same way. So it's very important. Those are not the most exciting parts of it, but they are one of the most important parts of it, I would say. Dan, did you want to add anything to some general?
No, just that transcripts are immensely difficult to make. They're extremely time consuming. Aleksandra and I have done them at different institutions in the past, and they're a big undertaking, even for doing one. If I think the general rule is 3 to 5 hours per hour of audio content. And the going rate for a transcriptionist is about $27 an hour. So just right there, that's a pretty large pool of money, especially because how many hundreds of hours a lot of interview places have. So you'll see a lot of transcripts come out of large institutions like universities and things like that. And then other institutions use kind of things like this. Because also you can highlight interviews to almost like prioritization for transcription too through this. See the general content. Is this going to be something that we're going to potentially use soon so we can start transcribing?
Yeah, sometimes you may be able to get a grant for a specific project, and then you can use the grant to transcribe the interviews, but it would be very brave to assume that you can transcribe all your interviews.
Life work.
Yeah.
Do it, most likely, honestly.
Yeah. So this is why we're doing audio logs and field notes. So the next slide talks about audio logs. This is the form that we are using. At the institution I worked before, we used very similar documents. So, it's not like there is one document for all oral history archives, but pretty much anybody who works with oral histories has the same idea of what needs to be included in such document. So on the top, you can see we just include the full name of the narrator, audio log for, and the narrator. Object ID, when we accession the interview as an artifact, as an object in our museum, it is assigned an object ID, so we also include it over there. And then we just have very generic information, general information. So again, full name of the narrator, interviewer's full name, audio log author, the interview date, location, and approximate total length of the interview. Then we have a short biography of the narrator. So just, 4 or 5 sentences about the most important parts of somebody's biography, just things that, when you create those documents, just a general thought, you have to think what the person who's going to use those documents are going to look for. So we don't know what, we may think that if we work on specific collection, that people who will be listening to those interviews will be interested in the same kind of content. But we don't really know what's going to happen 20 years from now. Like right now, one of our biggest collections is One Orlando. So all the interviews related to the Pulse nightclub shooting. However, there is a lot of content about other things as well. And a lot of those interviews can be used for completely unrelated research to Pulse shooting. So it's good to kind of highlight anything that is outstanding in the narrator's biography, because we don't really know how it's going to be used, for what kind of research is going to be used in the future. Then content of the interview, very, very similar thing. So just highlight the most important topics that appeared in the interview. It doesn't have to be long. Sometimes the interview is highly focused on just one big topic. So just, this is what you write over there. And then audio log. So as you can see, you just create short timestamps, 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 minutes long. And then you give a brief description of what the person was talking about during those few minutes. There is a lot details into it. As I said, it could be a separate presentation, what kind of information you should include, what you should leave out there. This is the format that we chose. As you can see, there's growing up in Orlando / summer trips to Disney World Resort. So summer trips is kind of like a subtopic to growing up in Orlando. This is the way we do it. You can come up with your own idea. But this is just a general form of how we process the entire interview. So even though we don't transcribe word by word, but we still highlight the main topics of the interview. So if we have a researcher coming into the museum, he can just read, or she, through the audio log and kind of get an idea where they will find information suitable for their research. And the second document that we create is field notes. On the next slide. And field notes are mostly to reflect things that may not be that obvious if you are just listening to the interview. So again, the beginning is the same. We have the name of the interviewer, narrator, field notes author. Again, we have a short biography of the narrator, short biography of the interviewer. It's also very important when it comes to social research. Everybody, all of us have some sort of background. And this background is like a luggage that we carry on our back, like invisible luggage that influences our worldview. Again, that's a topic for entire, semester of anthropology class. But just to have like a brief, just to realize that who we are can also influence the situation of the interview. So it's also important to include the interviewer's short biography. So the researcher who comes in, you know, can be aware of who the interviewer was. Note on recording. So if there is something that whoever listens to the interview should be ready, you know, let's say a lot of thunderstorms the minutes between 2025, or the interview is very quiet and it's recommended to use the headphones. You know, information like this is a place to include it. Then interviewers review. It's also a very important part of field notes because this is the place where interviewer can include information that is important for the interview, but you cannot see this from just listening to the interview. So let's say that the interviewee, the narrator, was for some reason very anxious, stressed, and uncomfortable, but it doesn't really reflect on the recording. But the interviewer feels like this impacted the interview greatly. This is a place to include this kind of information. Or if you know the narrator personally, this is a very important factor. So you always have to review that. You always have to include that information in field notes, that you personally have any sort of personal relationship with the person that you interviewed. And then search terms, again, very important because this is how your interview can be found by a researcher. So again, it's very important that your keywords or search terms are consistent, that you don't have 5 different search terms for the same institution, let's say. I always try to include as many search terms as possible, unless somebody mentions something very briefly and doesn't go any farther about certain things, I don't include it then. But other than this, if there is a name of an institution, because again, we never know who is going to use those interviews for what kind of research. Sometimes we have people talking about places that, you know, don't even exist anymore, but we don't know. Maybe 20 years from now, somebody will be working on a book about, you know, forgotten bars of downtown Orlando. And then this is a perfect way to get information about that. So always try to include as many search terms as possible. That's it about field notes.
The only thing I was going to add is also with the narrator's review, it's important too for the narrator to reference if maybe there was something going on personally, like you know, if you had, you know, an upsetting phone call right before you started, if, you know, there's something going on personally, just say, you know, that's the kind of place where you might include that kind of information, something like that.
Oh, yes. Yes.
All right, so let's get on to the fun part. Recommendations for oral history, things to listen to, read to, things like that. I realized I just said listen to or read to, and these are all books. But so.
But you can listen to audiobooks.
That's true. That's true. That's true. So some favorites of mine, After the Fall is a really, really just absolutely beautiful, heart-wrenching book about New Yorkers in the wake of 9/11. It's just a really excellently researched and studied book about it. It was done by the Columbia University Oral History Program, which is excellent. It's a really, really great book about the topic, and it focuses a lot on the life of New Yorkers, not necessarily just first responders, but just people in the city and how their lives were disrupted by it. It has a really incredible chapter on disabled people that really was very eye-opening about how, like, everyday functioning in the city was really damaged by the attacks. At the Edge of the Empire, it's a book about Soviet Kyrgyzstan and Kyrgyz people basically reckoning with the collapse of the Soviet Union. It is a incredible book. It's done in a format where it's individual person and then transcription of the interviews. So it's a great like primary source too, of just if you want to review exactly how the interview went and the things that they said, it's really great. The Good War by Studs Terkel, really great book on the American experience during World War II. It's not just soldiers, it also has factory workers back in the United States, loved ones of soldiers who went abroad. It's absolutely great. And then for anybody who is actually interested in doing oral history, the Oxford Handbook of Oral History is incredible. Top to bottom, it has information about doing interviews, it has information about preparing interviews, it has information on legal implications of interviews, case studies of oral history projects, good and bad. It is a perfect companion for anybody who's very interested in doing it. And it's excellent, excellent. So those are my recommendations.
So I have few recommendations as well. So first of all, it's in Polish, so I apologize for that, but it's not really, I mean, I don't apologize that it's in Polish, but I just know you may not be able to actually read it, so I'm just gonna explain what it is. This is a publication of an institution that I worked at before. So this is a good example of what a museum can do with their oral history archive. So it's a book, I actually have it right here. It's not very big, as you can see. So they publish a lot of books like that about certain topics. This one is specifically about homecomings, Warsaw 1945-46. So after liberation, after the end of World War II, people were coming back to Warsaw from the exiles and experiencing of people coming back. So it only has like one page of introduction, and the rest are only quotes from interviews. So the entire story is formed from the quotes. So as you can see, the bolded, parts are the names of a person, the name of a person, and then a quote. Again, name of another person, a quote. It's complemented with the pictures that are, that relate to the story. So altogether, all the quotes form a narrative about homecomings to Warsaw between 1945-46. Also, there is a CD attached with parts of those interviews. And in the end, you have the list of all the interviews with the call numbers. So if you're interested in hearing more, you can go to History Meeting House and you can listen to the entire interview in their library. So this is one of the examples what you can do with your oral history collection as an institution such as museum. The other recommendation that actually is available in English, and I very truly highly recommend this author, Ciecielag Aleksandra. She is born in Ukraine to a Ukrainian mother and Belarusian father. She writes in Russian though, so her ethnic background is very complex. She is often portrayed as Belarusian author, but she doesn't really assign herself to any specific ethnicity. Fact is, she writes in Russian. She won a Nobel Prize award for literature for 2015. As you can see, after 2015, a lot of her books were translated into English. My guess is because she got the Nobel Prize. So the first recommendation is The Unwomanly Face of War, an oral history of women. So this is experience of women in the Soviet Army. Very interesting study. It was published in Russian in 1985. It was actually translated into English a year later, but I think it only was partially translated. And then it was republished in 2017. Another very interesting book, Last Witnesses, an oral history of the children of World War II. Again, originally from 1980s, in English, published in 2019. And very interesting last recommendation, Secondhand Time, The Last of the Soviets. It's a study that she did in 1990s and beginning of 2000s. It's a book based on oral histories with people about their perception of Soviet Union and the transformation in Russia. So the Secondhand Time refers to 1990s and 1990s Russia, where everything kind of had to, it was like capitalism, but not really. Like, not to go into too much details, very interesting books. And what I think is interesting also and important for us is that she's actually the first author ever to get a Nobel Prize in Literature that uses this kind of writing, that writes based on oral histories. So as you can see, you can go far with doing oral histories. But just being serious, amazing books, and she's also an amazing writer and an oral historian. And the last recommendation I have, also in Polish, can we have the next slide? Thank you. Also in Polish, however, it's a very interesting example. It's a very new book. It was just published in 2020, so the beginning of this year. And it's oral history of the transformation. So this period of time when Poland, changed from the centrally planned market into capitalism, and how people that worked in factories, that worked in jobs that existed in communist times but were completely shut down in 1990s in capitalism, how did they deal with this transformation? So even though book is about Poland and written, published in Polish, I think it's very interesting approach that could be also used in United States, especially in communities that have very heavily rely on one employer. And Dan had a very good example.
Yeah, so it's that book is, they say, in Harlan County, which Aleksandra is reading, from Aleksandra Portelli. He's an Italian oral historian, but he works on, does a lot of work in American history. And the book focuses on, like, the union. It talks to men who were active during the unionization movements in the teens and 20s, sometimes involving, large-scale gun battles in Kentucky to unionize mine workers, and then up through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, which was kind of the collapse of the coal industry. And so you have these, you have these communities that were bounded together by one industry, and that became the primary thing that built hospitals, made sure roads were constructed. Most of the people shopped at the county or the company store. And then what happens when the company leaves or goes bankrupt? So that's kind of the things that it grapples with, is that the confrontation built into that industry and unionization efforts in there, but then also what leaving does to the community that was there and built around it. It's absolutely excellent.
Yes, and I don't know if you could see it because I think it only shows the person who talks. I'm not sure. So just in case, I wanted to show the book again because I borrowed it from Dan before the pandemic. So I have it now. So this is the book, Aleksandra Portelli. This is the cover. It's much larger book than the one I showed previously. So yeah, as Dan said, very, very interesting, very good recommendation.
He also has another, I think one of his first books was about Italian fascism in memory, if anybody, just for love of European history. But, okay. Any questions? We got any questions from anybody? I'll check on the Facebook and see if anybody asked any.
No, I don't think we have any questions.
Yeah, it doesn't look like it.
Well, If you do have questions, but don't feel like asking right now, here are our emails. So feel free to email us, and we'll be happy to assist with any
Yeah.
questions you may have.
Yep. I don't see any posts there. Okay. Well, yeah. Please feel free to email us. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you have.
Okay, I think that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and